Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where you meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Gothberg.
Mind the gap between the train and the platform.
This is the 34th episode of the Shipping Podcast. I am going to introduce to you a guest who 3 of the previous guests actually have suggested that I'd made an interview with. It's still in the series of my podcast interviews that I made when I was in London early February. I visited Kathi Stanzel, the managing director of INTERTANKO, in her office in the city of London on the 5th of February. When I found out that INTERTANKO had appointed Kathi Stanzel as their new managing director, I tried to connect with her over LinkedIn. She was very polite. She sent me an answer saying, "I don't have a habit of connecting with people whom I've never met before." So I told her, "Okay, I'm coming to London. I will come and meet you." And I think she was rather surprised the first time that I actually turned up on her doorstep saying, "Can I have a cup of coffee?" But we sat down and we had a really long chat about shipping, ship owners, tankers, environment, and so on. So, in addition to the people who has actually asked for an interview with Kathi, she was my dream guest as well. I hope you will enjoy the episode, which is sponsored by the MF Shipping Group, which is an independent ship management company, and whose CEO you are able to listen to in one of the previous episodes. The CEO's name is Kathi Stanzel. But without further ado, this is Kathi Stanzel. Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, Kathi Stanzel. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hi Lena, I'm Kathi Stanzel. I'm the Managing Director of INTERTANKO.
So what is INTERTANKO?
We are a trade association for independent tanker owners. So we represent and work for and on behalf of independent owners that have their own ships. So that's owners that are not associated with a national oil company or a national fleet. And they are basically from all sizes and all areas of the tanker sector. So we have gas tankers, LNG, LPG, we have chemical tankers, we have some very specialist parcel tankers, for example, and then we have anything in oil and product, and from very large ones to very small ones.
So how many members are there?
We're just finalizing renewals for 2016. Last time we checked, there was about 220 full members with a fleet of over 3,600 ships.
Wow.
It's a large fleet, yes. And we think, we haven't actually done the figures for this year, but we think we have about 65% of the independent tanker tonnage. The crucial thing, I think, to say about INTERTANKO is it's a quality club. So there are 4 pages worth of entrance requirements to be able to become a member. And then all the members really adhere to some very strict guidelines as to quality of operations, safety, environmental protection. And it really wants itself as a body that represents them in front of regulators, in front of the International Maritime Organization, but also that supports them developing best practice, for example, and to provide operational support as well. And then, of course, we're a forum for them to meet, because obviously any professional needs a forum where you have peers that can just exchange experience, exchange knowledge to push the industry forward. And that's what INTERTANKO does for them.
And what is your background?
I'm actually kind of an alien in the industry, I guess. I trained as a marine biologist, and I came into shipping via pollution from ships. So initially as a marine biologist, I worked on marine park projects and environmental impact assessments. And then I ended up looking more at pollution from vessels. So I worked for many years with the International Tanker Owners Pollution Federation as a technical advisor. And there we literally looked at how we minimize pollution, for example, from oil spills, from chemical spills when there were accidents. And that's how I sort of entered the industry sort of slightly sideways, I guess. And it's been an interesting journey. I would have never assumed when I started my studies in Germany that I would end up A, as a marine biologist, or B, in the shipping sector.
But you're from Germany?
Yes.
Whereabouts in Germany?
I was born in Karlsruhe, which is in the Rhine Valley, southwest Germany. Beautiful area. Very good food, because we're very close to the French border, close to the Swiss border. It's a lovely place, but it's probably as far from the sea as you can get in Germany. So it has nothing to do with the marine environment. It was a lucky coincidence, I guess, that's got me here.
I think that is interesting.
It was actually because I didn't speak English well enough that I've ended up doing what I do today. Because actually, I had a degree in Germany, so I went to Heidelberg University, and I studied genetics and microbiology, and I was looking at plant genetics in particular. That was my favorite subject. And I actually did that because I wanted to be an astronaut with the European Space Agency. And at the time, because this is decades and decades ago, the requirement was that you needed 2 European languages and then either English or Russian in addition. And my school English was really bad. I spoke German fluently, I spoke French fluently, but my school English was not good. And our professor at the time, when I graduated, sat us down and said, well, so you think you can be this hotshot little scientist or astronaut, and let me tell you, you will fail unless you can stand up in front of a big auditorium full of people and convince them that the research funding must go to your project and your project alone in English. And at that point, I mean, we all hated him for that, but he was right. He was absolutely right. And I then decided that actually I needed to take a year to just brush up English. And I applied for a number of universities elsewhere to just do postgraduate studies, to just actually get the vocabulary in, not to do a specific study. And it's before the days of organized programs. So we didn't have Erasmus. It didn't exist then. And a lot of them, because it was all also done by a proper letter. So the time frames were very long. To get any information was really difficult, because you would have to literally go to a library to research addresses and things. There was no internet to speak of. And so I actually ended up going to our overseas student advisor, which was at the university. It was a position that was held at the university. And I made an appointment with him, and he was late. Because he was late, I was sitting in his office waiting for him, and he had a bunch of books on his shelf. And they were all these big leather-bound books. And on the spine it just said, Universities of the Commonwealth. And I must admit to my shame, I didn't even know what the Commonwealth really was. So I just sort of took the first one off the shelf, opened it up, and started with A, Australia. I thought, oh, they have universities in Australia. And I literally copied some addresses down and, just started reading a little bit. And then he arrived. And I put the book back and we talked about it. And he said, well, the best place for you to go is McGill University in Canada, because they are great with plant genetics. Send your application here. And so I toddled off and wrote some application letters. And I thought, well, seeing that I'm typing these letters, I may as well type them 2 or 3 times and just change the address. So I applied to McGill, and I applied to a number of the universities in Australia that I'd copied the addresses for. And by a number of coincidences, I ended up in Australia instead of Canada. And I ended up doing marine biology. And I liked it so much that instead of actually just staying for a year learning English, I did a second degree and I graduated as a marine biologist. And then everything changed from there.
Isn't that funny from time to time how life just changes because of something else happening?
I think that's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah.
You just have to go with the flow, though. You have to just be ready to take it when it comes.
Yeah, I agree. So when did shipping come into your life?
It was another coincidence, actually. I was in Indonesia. I was running a marine park, or I was working on running a marine park, which had been gazetted on paper, but nobody thought about how to enforce it, really. And there were people living there. So for the government to suddenly draw a line on a map and say, this is now a protected area, you can't fish, didn't really help the local people that actually survived on fishing. But so we had a great project going that was looking at alternative livelihoods and very, very interesting work, also looking at what was there, because it was in the Indo-Pacific. And that's one of the most biodiverse areas of the world. So should have been wonderfully pristine, but of course with the pressures of people living there were a lot of issues with degradation, with overfishing, with sometimes destructive fishing practices. So fascinating work. The funding came from AusAid, which is the Australian equivalent of, I can't remember what it's called in the UK, but it's effectively foreign aid. And a lot of the funding came from Australia because the Australians realized that Indonesian fishermen were poaching in Australian waters because they had no choice because of pressures on the resources in Indonesia. And then the Asian crisis happened in the mid-90s. And the conditions in Indonesia got more and more difficult and more dangerous to work. And then at one stage, the Australians said, well, we cannot justify funding Indonesia at this point in time until it stabilizes. So they froze my project, which left me with a choice of either staying there with no support or leaving until it was reopened. So initially I went to home base, which was Perth, Fisheries Department in Perth, Australia. But then I had the wrong passport. I wasn't Australian. So with a German passport, we quickly found out that there was just nothing for me to do and I had to leave. And I came back to Europe in, when was that? Probably 96, 97. Yeah, 97 it must have been. With effectively no future because the project was on ice. I had put a lot of effort into it. I'd learned Bahasa Indonesia. I was kind of established to stay in Indonesia, and then the whole thing had collapsed. So I temped, and temping was a concept. Yeah, it's just short work for an agency, for a multilingual agency, and London was the place to do it. And I stayed with friends, and we had a great summer, and it was probably about 6 months. And at the end of that, I thought, well, I now need to get a real job. And the options that I had were really limited to becoming a researcher at a university in Germany. That's sort of what the outlook.
And you had given up the astronaut thing?
Yes, I had pretty much given that up. And I was getting too old by then as well. So I lined up some interviews with German universities, and I was actually at Heathrow flying back from London to have some interviews in Germany. And I picked up the Guardian newspaper, Saturday edition, which is always a nice fat newspaper. And I'm sitting on the plane and I read the job pages. And I'm just trying to think, the job pages usually occur on a Thursday. Maybe it was a Thursday. It doesn't matter. But anyway, I was reading the Guardian and here was an advert for a job in London that was a technical advisor position with the International Association that looks after supporting tanker owners in accidents, ITOPF. And I read the advert, and I remember that very clearly because it was very emotional. I read the advert and I thought, that is written for me. Because what they were looking for was an environmentalist with hands-on experience in fieldwork, hands-on experience with marine issues to work for effectively a club of ship owners. And I saw the advert and I was convinced that that was for me. And so I went to my university interview in Germany on the Monday and they offered me the job. And I turned it down.
Wow.
And I remember sitting on the train back from the interview thinking, what have I done? I've just destroyed my life. I've just thrown away the chance of having a paid job with a German university that was of very good standing because of something that I haven't even applied for yet. But to cut a long story short, I ended up doing that job for 10 years.
Yeah. Wow. And what did you do then? I mean, what was the content of that job once you got it?
ITOPF is it's a very interesting little organization, actually. They basically provide expertise when something goes wrong. So as a technical advisor, I was standing by. We used to have pagers. That was also the very early days of mobile phones and things. So we just had a pager, a radio pager. And if there was a shipping accident somewhere, they would page us and we would assess whether they needed help to minimize environmental damage. So, for example, if there was an oil spill or any kind of chemical issues, we would then fly out to site as quickly as we could and just assist anybody who needed help. So very often we would work with the government locally. Sometimes we would work with the response companies. We would work with environmental agencies. We would work with the shipping companies, the salvors. It was very broad. And the remit was always just to minimize damage.
The P&I clubs.
P&I clubs used to be involved as well, absolutely, because the P&I clubs obviously are the ones that end up paying the bill.
That is how I know about ITOPF.
Yes.
Because I used to work with marine insurance.
Yeah. And then from there, I guess, I ended up doing various other things, and I got headhunted into INTERTANKO 5 years ago.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I think you are so suitable as a CEO of INTERTANKO. So I was a bit curious about how did they find you? But of course, you must have made an impression from that side then, ITOPF.
I probably was a known entity in the industry. But I agree with you. I also wonder, how did they find me? And that's another interesting story. And I don't know if it's one for the podcast, but I was at my desk. And at the time I was working for the IOPC fund, which is actually a UN body that administers one of the compensation conventions. So, I was effectively working for the United Nations as a civil servant by then. And I'm sitting at my desk and I got a phone call and somebody said, "Oh, hello, Miss Stanzel. Can we talk to you about INTERTANKO?" And my instant reaction was, "Oh God, I'm being interviewed on something I don't know enough about." So I stalled the call and I actually said, "It's a really bad time. Can I call you back in 5 minutes?" So I took the number down to check also whether that was a legitimate call. And in those 5 minutes, obviously used Google to get an update on what INTERTANKO policies were, because I knew about their work, but very loosely. Very remotely, effectively. And I'd had dealings with INTERTANKO in the industry, but I'd never actually taken a great interest in the detail of their work. So I did a bit of Googling and then called back and thought, right, okay, so now I can take the interview. And then she said, no, it's about getting you interviewed. Which was very interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, you are the first female CEO, aren't you?
I am. I guess it's not that difficult, really, because INTERTANKO was established in 1970, and there have only been 5 CEOs since then. So the longevity has been quite significant. So there hasn't been a lot of change. And yes, but you're right. I am the first woman.
I do interviews with so many first women nowadays.
That might be a common thread, actually. Yes, but what they say. One of the things that always tickles me is there's a bit of research that says that quite often when things don't go so well, women are chosen as CEOs because everybody thinks it can't get any worse, so let's just give it to a woman.
Oh my God.
So the interim CEO thing.
But I don't think that is the case in this case.
Well, if you look at it from a market perspective, from a commercial perspective, I took over, and some of my friends said that to me when I made the decision to actually join INTERTANKO. They said, "Are you completely nuts? You're taking over an industry body that represents tanker owners at the time when the tanker market is in complete freefall. It's going down and nowhere else but down. And we were really going for the very bottom of the market cycle. And it was absolutely terrible times for members. It was really awful. So for the first 3 years of being here, yes, they were suffering. And of course, the pressure is relentless then to actually provide value. And it did very much feel like I was the interim CEO. You couldn't break it any more than it was already broken. But of course now, happily, we're at the moment on the upcycle, and we have been for a little while, so we're doing much better at the moment.
I read about the key issues that you identified in 2012 that you were going to work on your strategic plan. How's that going along?
It's very interesting, actually, because we had, and I guess that's something that happens to a lot of people, because we have so many members with very broad interests, and of course our core membership are the ship owners, but then we have associate members, about 300 associate members, that are associated with the tanker industry in any form. So they are from lawyers to paint manufacturers. Anybody who has anything to do with the tanker industry also becomes or can become an associate member if we believe that it's beneficial for the quality ideas of INTERTANKO, so to develop the best practice. So a lot of class societies are associate members, for example. And so, of course, with that background, INTERTANKO works in a way where the secretariat is quite lean, and we do our work with the input from the real experts in the shipping companies and the associate membership, which means that what we do day to day, the actual work, is being done through and with the input from members and associate members. And that makes us so strong and so credible because we get real information from real people. Now, that also means, of course, that when you have a bunch of experts together, I mean, look at our safety and technical committee, for example. We're talking about 40 highly experienced and highly specialized experts in their field, many with decades of experience in their work, coming together, bouncing off each other, working on issues that they've identified, but also constantly identifying new issues. And so what had happened over time is the traditional mission creep. So we were trying to do more with less all the time, and people kept coming with new ideas and more things that we should be doing, while at the same time criticizing the association for not being tanker specific. Because they're saying, well, you are INTERTANKO. We have other associations that deal with shipping issues. We have BIMCO that are very strong on documentary things, for example. So why would I need to have you develop a clause for something when there is already a BIMCO clause? So there was a lot of these very justified, I think, questions as to, does your work plan, is it strategically driven, or is it just whatever you've accumulated? So the first thing we did is we looked at all the issues that were on the work plans for the various committees, and we have 12 technical committees. So there is a lot of input. We have literally hundreds of experts feeding in. And then in addition, we get questions, because there's operational questions being pinged to the Secretariat where we help out and we try and disseminate information and best practice. So lots and lots of input to then try and get a structure into that and say, right, if we look at the higher level, what are our main focus areas? And it took a little while to get through that and actually make it into a strategic plan, which we managed to do. And we then said, right, can we prioritize these issues? And can we say which are the real tanker-specific issues that are top of our agenda, that need to be top of our agenda, and which are the issues that we can work with others because they're not that special? And it was difficult because, just to give you an example, and we can talk about the work plan specifically in a minute, but to give you an example, when we're talking about ballast water management, it's not a tanker-specific issue. Everyone will have to do it. But if you look at the types of ships that our members run, the pumping volume, for example, for a tanker is huge compared to that of a ferry or a container vessel, because we ballast and deballast during loading and discharge. That's really the only time we will change the ballast conditions of the vessel. So therefore, we need to make sure that the ballast pumps and the volume of those ballast pumps doesn't restrict the speed of our load and discharge operations, because that's money, effectively, under the bottom line. And that also means that because of the way our trade works, we have ballast legs that are quite significant, because obviously you pick up oil somewhere, you take it somewhere, discharge it, and then you don't pick up oil where you've just discharged, because that might be a refinery that only takes oil in, so there's no crude loading. So it's natural to have long ballast legs, therefore large volumes of ballast water that we then need to discharge when we take a load again. So the problems for us when it comes to ballast water management are different, and they're greater than for many other sectors. Dry bulk is a little bit similar to us, but for us it's very, very specific, where we said, okay, so ballast water has to be our priority. Although other people also have issues with it, to us it is actually crucial. And so while we were looking at refining that strategic plan, we had a lot of those kind of discussions where we said, well, is it tanker specific? Yes or no? If it's not tanker specific, how high should it be on the priority list? And if you remember, a number of years ago, we had huge issues on the security side, for example, with transfers in the Indian Ocean with piracy. Is that a tanker-specific issue? No, but we are low and slow when we're loaded. So you would come with a full load of crude oil out of the Gulf. You would have to make those transits at a speed of maybe 12, 13 knots, which is actually very slow if you're trying to avoid attack. And in addition to that, we had all the additional problems that other ships didn't have, where our ships carry dangerous cargoes, which means that we are hugely safety focused. And if you have a ship where you can't even take a photograph without a hot work permit, because you might create a spark by clicking the camera, you then certainly do not want somebody with a firearm on board. So there were lots of specific issues which, when you say piracy, is it tanker specific? No. Does it have to be high priority? Absolutely. So it took us a while to get that work plan shaped and prioritized and focused right. And we managed to do that. And I think we've kind of managed to find a home for all the high priority issues. But now, of course, the issues are changing.
Yeah, all the time.
All the time. And if you now look at it, suddenly, what do we have? Cyber. Cyber was not on the radar when I joined. 5 years ago, well, we knew there were issues, but it wasn't right in front of us. It was something that we considered and we thought, well, okay, yes, you need to be careful with that. But it really has come high up on the agenda in the last couple of years. So things are constantly changing.
Yeah, it's a moving target.
It is a moving target.
Mm-hmm. But what you did put up at that time.
What we did put up at that time,
That
yes.
was sustainability of the tanker industry.
That was, yeah. And that was very interesting. It was a new focus. Because before that, the focus had been very much on technical issues. Because, of course, as a trade association, we have to be very careful not to stray into areas that are maybe antitrust sensitive. So we have nothing to do with, like the liner conferences or something like that. That's not something we would ever get engaged with. But what happened, of course, at the beginning is we looked at it and we said, well, so what are the issues for us? Well, the human element is a huge issue. Human element, very, very crucial because, of course, our crews have to be much better trained than on other ships because our ships are A, more sophisticated, but B, also carry very dangerous cargoes. And if something goes wrong, consequences are worse. Therefore, in the tanker sector, the crews do get additional training. They get more training. They get better paid as well. And I think we really have to make sure that A, there is a pipeline of more crew, especially for the highly specialized vessels, the gas vessels nowadays, but also to make sure that the human element is considered in everything we do. Whether that's on the bridge with new equipment or whether it's in the ergonomics or whether it's in the welfare, actually. So at the core of everything we do is actually human element. Then we obviously had environmental issues, high on the agenda, very diverse, possibly less tanker specific, although there are some, for example, waste disposal. For us is a huge issue because it's a hazardous waste. And we are still finding after decades of lobbying and pushing that even in Europe, the ports do not have the reception facilities we need to make sure that we can dispose of stuff safely. And then we had other specific issues that we were looking at, and sustainability really wasn't on there. So when people were starting to talk about sustainability, what they initially talked about was, how do we survive? Because the market, as I said, was going nowhere but down at the time. But because we can't talk about the market itself, we talked about, right, how do we do business? And one of the interesting things that I learned when I joined was that, for example, in the tanker sector, on the crude side, for example, on the oil side, what happens is the payment is actually made at the end of the voyage on completion of discharge. So a tanker owner with, let's say, a VLCC, a very large crude carrier, may take a load. So they'll be in a port, they'll take a load on board, and then the vessel will be at sea for, on average, 6 weeks, incurring underway, of course, dues for maybe getting the fuel paid, getting the crew paid, getting the insurance, the maintenance, everything else. But also for some of the smaller vessels, there's canal fees, there's all sorts of things. And then after six weeks or so, they arrive, they discharge, and only at the end of the discharge will they actually get paid any money at all. So they front load, and they actually have a huge capital expenditure, and the cash flow needs, therefore, are completely different from other sectors. And what we were then finding is when the markets were really, really bad, in addition to that, the charterers would pay late. So instead of actually paying on completion of discharge, they would then pay 6, 7, 8 days late. And then the demurrage payments would be even later than that. So all the additional costs that the shipowner had already paid for, which was, they're just passed on. There's no profit element in that. But those costs would be paid sometimes 3 months late, which, of course, it's not good business practice. And the interesting thing was when we started discussing that with some of the large charterers that actually have some of their own fleets, they would say, yeah, it's really annoying us as well because it's happening to us. We're operators like you. We think it's completely unacceptable. Why should we, any commercial invoice, payment terms would be what? 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks if you're lucky, but certainly not 3 months. You can't operate like that. And so our sustainability work was actually looking at the way we do business. And we looked at, for example, brokers' fees at one stage and said, well, the way the tanker sector pays broker fees, we actually pay a percentage to the broker on the cost of fuel, which actually makes no sense because the broker isn't doing anything to the cost of fuel, but it's included in the percentage paid. And we're saying, well, does that make sense? Nobody else does it. Why do we do it? So we learned a lot about historically how business was done. And we looked at business practices and we said, are there any business practices we should be working on? And actually one thing that came out of that work was the recognition that actually maybe we needed a code of conduct, a code of ethics, or it's linked to corporate social responsibility, but it isn't just that. It's just about how do we want to do business with each other? And then we thought, well, we can't ask anybody else to do that if we're not subscribing to it ourselves. So when we had our annual event in New York a couple of years ago, we actually said, well, why don't we, as members of INTERTANKO, of this quality club, subscribe very publicly to a code of conduct, which is really, really basic. It just basically said, and it says today, that we will treat business partners the way we wish to be treated. It's that kind of, if you really summarize it, that's what it is. So you will not hide anything. You will not, business should be open and transparent and on an even keel. And we had a huge positive reaction to that, actually, partly because people actually say, well, let's take the moral high ground. We need to act like that so that everybody else can act like that. And for us, it also meant looking at, for example, how we treated suppliers. Because we're a supplier to the charterer, supplying the service of transporting their oil or chemicals. But equally, how do we pay, for example, our bills for bunkers or our bills for whatever else it might be, the agents? That's the kind of, our management fees, etc. Are we paying in time? So it was a really interesting piece of work. And I think what we were looking for and what we actually managed to do is change behaviors.
That's interesting.
I mean, some people are very cynical about it. And they say, well, it's easy to do when you have the moral high ground, and it's easy to do when you're able to survive. But for us, we were doing this at the bottom of the market. We were doing it when everyone was actually suffering. We're saying, no, it doesn't matter where we are in the cycle. This should be the rule generally. Making this business sustainable as a supply chain, because we are the pipeline of the world. The energy supply chain runs on ships and with ships. So there's so much attached to that. It should really work very well. And that's what we were trying to do with that work.
Impressive, I think.
Well, we learned a lot. I certainly did learn a lot. There was so many aspects to it. It was very interesting.
And your members learned a lot as well.
I think so, because we clarified, because a lot of those discussions, especially when people are not doing well commercially, a lot of those discussions very quickly go into the emotional part, where there is just the upset and the anger at being treated badly, for example, when actually what we needed to do was just have a business discussion to say, does this make sense? What are we actually doing here? And that was interesting.
Mm. So you've been around in the shipping industry for a while now then?
Yes.
What are the biggest changes that you have seen?
I guess the interesting thing for me has been, as a biologist, that there is a much better understanding today, or a much wider understanding of environmental issues. It's common knowledge today. You can assume that everybody who's involved in shipping understands, for example, biofouling. And I remember that when we were talking about the toxicity of anti-fouling paints, for example, people didn't understand what was that about. And of course, it has allowed us to be much more advanced today when we're looking at environmental protection from a bigger perspective, because by taking away the toxicity from the anti-fouling paints, we benefited the environment because we're not introducing TBT and other things into the food chain anymore, which is great. We have increased, of course, hull fouling initially, and we had to find different ways of reducing hull fouling by using different structures on the hull, different types of coatings. I mean, it's been very interesting without the toxicity factor. And of course, today, that is benefiting us because environmentally, today, we're looking at energy efficiency. And we can see that every time we look at any data from member vessels, that as soon as the hull gets fouled, the fuel consumption goes up. And it's unbelievable how quickly that happens. So hull management is a standard practice with everybody today, while 10 years ago, some people were doing it, but it wasn't high on the agenda because you didn't have to. Today you have to think about it. And of course, for us, that brings additional interest because now we need to make sure that countries don't stop us from taking hull management in safe environments. So we had a number of countries that said, oh, you can clean the hull, but not in my harbour, not in my backyard, please. And we're saying, well, we need to do it somewhere where it's safe because surely, the safety of the crew and the vessel and the cargo and the environment all together have to be as a top priority here. So make sure that we have a procedure in place where we can do it somewhere safely because we have to do it regularly, and we do it regularly. And ultimately what it benefits is our emissions from shipping because we're reducing fuel consumption. So all of that, the kind of links today are much better understood, which makes my job more interesting because I can talk to people about stuff that I like, and that's interesting.
And that's one way to see it.
Well, to be honest, it is, because I feared when I entered the industry that it would all be about the bottom line. And the thing with INTERTANKO is that it's everything but. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating to me to what extent our members share knowledge and data and information for the pure, selfless reason of making the industry better. I mean, we're just now engaged in a sister ship study, for example, where we have data from identical sister ships built in the same yard, operated by the same member, which is made available to the rest of the membership so we can learn how to model energy efficiency effectively, how to model the effects of various measures we've taken on board, operational measures we're taking on board, but also things like the influence of weather, the influence of cargo heating, etc., etc. It's fascinating. And our members will actually share that for the benefit of the industry when, if you look at it from the outside, you would think, why would they? They're benefiting their competitors because commercially they will compete to the death.
Yeah.
But operationally and technically, when it makes the industry safer and more efficient, they will share, they will develop best practice, and they will really take the moral high ground. And I'm very proud of that. I think otherwise I wouldn't work here.
So how do you see the future then?
It's a good question, but I think one key element is going to be the human element in all of this, because we keep asking seafarers to do more and more and more on the administrative side. There's more and more regulations. There's more and more rules how to do things. And I think people need to remember that on board ship, it isn't just about paperwork. You're actually in a very, sometimes hostile environment. You have complicated jobs. I mean, anyone who's ever seen a cargo operation on a tanker, people forget that. They think, oh yeah, you just pump it empty or you just fill it up. And they forget that you can very easily break a ship's back if you don't load the tanks in the right order to make sure that the trim stays correct and to make sure that we're not breaking her back by loading forward and aft and not in the middle. And it's completely second nature to the experts that are on board. And that's the thing. We need to start seeing seafarers as experts in their jobs. They're not just truck drivers. They're highly specialized people. They're professionals. And I think we look at flight crews. We recognize them as experts and we acknowledge them as professionals. And with seafarers, sometimes that doesn't happen yet. So there are lots and lots of people sitting at IMO, for example, that look at the benefit of the greater good, at the protection of the environment, and they keep making regulations, but we never actually rationalize what's already there. So sometimes what we're fighting for, in particular at IMO or in Brussels as well with the European community, also in the US with the Coast Guard, are things where they make it impossible to do the right thing. And that's one of the biggest challenges we have. We need to think about how do we deliver what we want as humanity on board ship. And we're trying to make that happen. And it's going to be a huge challenge because regulation keeps coming on more and more issues. I mean, we see it happening at IMO. We need to look at the bigger picture, definitely, and very urgently. So that's one of the things. In particular, also with the systems that are getting more and more sophisticated. I mean, I know what happens in this office when we change from one version of Windows to the next. The wailing and gnashing of teeth can be heard in Oslo. It's unbelievable. So to think about the kind of software changes that come with all the machinery and equipment on board ship, why would it be any different? You know, the people that run these ships are still people. They're human. Let's give them the help they need to actually stay safe and have a job that's worth living for, effectively. I think that's it. So that the human factor needs to be in everything we do. And the big challenge that comes just after that, in my mind, the second one, is really that much more global thinking that we have today about emissions, about climate change, about everything in my mind that is political. Because unfortunately, those kind of political debates nowadays affect shipping in a completely different way than they used to. If I look at my time in IMO meetings, we used to go into IMO meetings and you would know that in the room, the country delegations would have ex-seafarers and mariners that had experience, that had been on board, that knew what it meant when a certain regulation was requiring a change in operational procedure, for example. Today, people in the country, governments that are being sent to IMO and the delegations, they're being asked to have much wider portfolios. A lot of them have to do not just shipping, they do transport. So they do aviation, they do trains, they do cars, they're no longer experts. It's really hard for them to have a good understanding of what we're actually discussing at IMO. And then to make sure that the political decision making, which the UN invariably is exposed to because it is about this planet, to then keep that in the right measure when we're talking about technical stuff is really hard. So what we're seeing at IMO is that the debate is going away from a technical debate as to what is achievable, safest, and most beneficial overall to a political debate as to, you know, which nation supports which other nation, what global goals could be achieved. And it's very, very difficult, I think, to steer that course and steer it well. Because if it is a political debate, then don't ask the experts to justify it. You know, just make a political decision and then we will deal with it. But what's happening at the moment is people try and hide behind technical expertise and technical reasoning when actually it's a political debate. There'll be a political decision from an elected government and they're sovereign countries. Those countries will make a decision that they feel is best for their population. They're elected into that position. Really, the technical experts have no say in that. There is no right and wrong.
So where is the leadership coming from in this?
And that is a very good question. Because I think leadership can come from many angles. And we try and provide leadership when it comes to actually saying, right, okay, so this is what you want to achieve? Fine. Here is what we think we can do to achieve it. So this is why I mentioned the sistership study earlier. This is why we are now preempting effectively some of the political discussions that will be had at the UN level to say, right, we are standing by to tell you what is feasible on board ship or to tell you how emissions, for example, are influenced by different factors so that when you finally tell us what you're actually trying to achieve, what is the goal, what is the contribution, for example, to emissions from shipping, and how much do you want us to reduce it, we can tell you, okay, so here's your target, you've finally given us something tangible, this is how we think we might be able to achieve it. But at the moment, we have nothing. We're in the middle of a political debate and nobody is actually saying, this is what we think you're contributing, this is what we think you should contribute as a maximum.
So I don't have to ask you what you think about the COP21 and that shipping and aviation was left out of that.
I think it makes no difference, to be honest. I think we have a responsibility as an industry to be as energy efficient as we can be. And we always have had. And because people make this argument that now, because the oil price is so low, the bunker cost is low, and therefore we don't care anymore. It's complete rubbish. Because ultimately, yes, of course, while bunker costs were higher, there was even more of an incentive. But even today, with the bunker costs as they are, the cost of bunkers to run a ship is usually in our sector still about 60% of the cost overall. That's a significant piece of the cost. So therefore, of course, you're trying to reduce it. And long before IMO was mandating energy efficiency, in our sector, we used to look at energy efficiency. We used to have energy efficiency plans for each ship that our members were using long before it actually came in through IMO, because it makes sense. It's common sense.
Mm. So we are often looked upon as the hidden industry. I just learned a new expression. We are the Cinderella industry.
Oh, very nice. Good.
How would we become more visible to the rest of the world?
That's a really good question, actually. I don't think I have an answer for that, because I think a lot of what we do is interesting. And there are, if you look at, I think Quest is one of the television channels that very often has programs, for example, on big ships or big structures or, anything that's the biggest, the strongest, the largest, the heaviest, the whatever. So that obviously attracts people. I think if we could be more visual and we would have more stories about what happens on board a commercial vessel, for example, that might work. And Singapore has been doing that with a specific aim of attracting people into the seafaring tradition, actually. They put out a soap opera.
Oh, I see.
They put out a televised soap opera about the crew on board a commercial vessel that was traveling to various ports. And then there were all the typical soap opera elements of them having a girlfriend in a port and the wife at home, or the baby being born while the husband was away, or the mother being on board the ship when her children were graduating from school. So they actually put that into the populist arena. And people are smiling about it and going, oh my God, well, that's terrible. But it worked for them. It raised interest. And I remember when I was small, there used to be a series in Germany that was hugely popular. It was about a cruise ship. But I reckon that was probably sponsored by the cruise industry to get people on board a cruise ship, because you got a feel for what it was like. So I don't know whether we need to do more of that. I don't know if it would be beneficial necessarily, because I think it is a very specialist industry.
But on the other hand, there are so many cool things happening in our industry.
That is true.
That no one knows about. I see innovation every day now in the maritime industry. And I think that the regulations about the SECA has contributed to that. We are really at the best when it comes to innovation and
operational excellence as well,
engineering and new material taking. Everything that is happening, which could interest young people to study and come into the industry. Maybe we cannot be compared to the IT industry or the telecom industry, but almost. But we don't tell people about that.
I think it's probably harder to access as well, because ultimately there's a lot of support industries that are land-based that will contribute. The shipbuilding industry today, exactly as you were saying, the innovation of how we build a ship today from how we used to build it 20 years ago even, it's phenomenal and it's very interesting. And I think probably they have young, bright talent joining those industries in the engineering professions, etc., which may not have direct exposure to the actual shipping. So maybe we need to have more combinations of things where people get exposure, where they do. I was talking at a conference in St. Petersburg last year, because last year was the year dedicated by IMO as the sort of year that was looking at training of seafarers in particular. And we talked to a number of training schools and naval sort of maritime colleges and looked at their success and their challenges. And one of the things they said to us, those that had early integration with shipping, where cadets before they were even cadets, students were allowed to go on board and spend some sea time. And some of them actually have, literally after 6 months at school, they would spend 1 to 3 months on board ship. They had much lower dropout rates at the end of their degrees because people early on had the opportunity to see the realities and to then decide, is this for me or not? Because I think it's very important to realize that shipping isn't for everybody.
No.
It's a really tough industry when it comes to the realities and the conditions. And it's a little bit like, I'm trying to think what else there is. It takes a lot of will, I think, to be in shipping because it isn't easy. And it's a very risky industry, whether it's job security or anything else. The rewards are huge when you get them, but also the risk is significant.
My theory is that as shipping is changing, because I think it is, I think we are in a new paradigm changing. We will need more skills that we don't have within the industry yet.
Mm-hmm. I think you're probably right. Absolutely.
So we need to attract that.
Yes.
And then we can't say it's always risky and bad and heavy and so on. Yeah, some people is challenged by that. But and also I think, for instance, with the unmanned ships or however it's called, it's like maybe you need not just people who has been at sea to be recruited into the shipping companies, but also people with other skills. And then in my world, it will also open up for more women. Because there are not that many women that are sailing.
That's true. I think it is inherently a conservative industry. And probably more so than many others. That's just the reality.
Yeah.
And it's changing very, very slowly. Now, whether that is because of the harsh conditions, I don't know. It could just be that's how it established itself, and it's now changing very slowly. You're right, I think that probably a lot of the new technologies can assist us shifting that balance, but it does take special kind of women. And some of those you've interviewed, I mean, if you look at Consuelo, for example, in her position, she's probably unique in the world. There might be a handful of people like her that have the strength, the willpower, the resilience to do the job that she does and do it well, and to thrive on that challenge. It isn't for everybody. But you're right, there are probably large parts of jobs that may be ashore or that may be in specific areas. It doesn't all have to be blue water tonnage. It could be coastal shipping. It could be ferries. It could be, it doesn't have to be the bulk sector, which is probably one of the roughest that you can get in terms of the demands on the crew because of the pressures, the commercial pressures. So, yeah, I think overall you're right. We will have more.
But I also see, I see the younger generation coming into our business now. I mean, many ship owners, it's a family business. And then if the oldest generation used to work until they died on their post, now they feel like, well, I can't really see the light in the tunnel. So maybe I should retire and just enjoy the rest of my life as a retired person. And then they leave the company to the younger generation. So I see a lot of ship owners now being 35, 40 years old. And they have been given something from their parents that the parents didn't have. That is an education at a university abroad. So they have been used to a lifestyle and a certain way of doing things and the digital things. They are not the millennials, so they were not brought up with mobile phones and reading things like that. They were not. But they have used it now for everything else. And then they come into the ship-owning company. And maybe that will also put pressure of changes in procedures and business models and things like that. Because they're a new generation. Do you see them?
Yes, definitely. I think that there are two things that are changing. And it was probably about 4 years ago, I was privileged enough to sit at a table at a dinner with, and I think there were 8 of us at the table, and 7 were second or third generation ship owners. And funnily enough, or not funnily enough, I think it's probably quite logical, but all of them were reporting the same kind of issues. And the issues were that they were trying to take their family companies, which had been built on the technical expertise, usually, of their immediate ancestors or the father of the father, on the technical expertise of running a ship initially, to then bring those kind of family companies into the corporate world with corporate structures and sometimes corporate investors making different demands. And they were all reporting on the same challenges to make that transition. And it isn't for everybody, because that requires a lot of sensitivity to the old way of doing things and vision for the new way of potentially doing things, and then to marry the two. The other thing I see in addition to that is that there are more and more shipping companies that are public companies, which means that you have a much bigger influence of the shareholder in whatever shape or form he or she comes, whether that's private equity or the bank owning the vessel and a third-party manager taking care of the operations, or whatever structure it has. And that's going to change shipping as well. So it's an interesting time. I think we're in the middle of that change right now. And we're seeing that as well internally. I mean, INTERTANKO providing the platform to develop best practice, there is a lot more focus on corporate structures, professional management. And you're right, a lot of these people are highly educated. They have the best degrees, they have the best minds and the best brains. So, yeah, it's a very exciting time.
I agree. Did you ever have a role model?
That's a very good question. Not in real life, unfortunately. I think I was, probably in that generation where there wasn't really a direct role model. There was a television series called Moonbase Alpha that had a female doctor who was an important part of the management team. And I do remember, I think her name was Barbara Bain, the actress. That probably influenced what I was thinking as a very young child.
There comes the astronaut thing.
Hopefully not just. Hopefully not just. No, but I think I've noticed that about myself, that one of the things my parents managed to do for me, and I don't know if they tried on purpose or whether it just happened, is that they made me completely immune to peer pressure. And I think maybe that's linked to the fact that I never had a particular role model. I have many people I admire, but there isn't anyone I aspire to be like. I always had elements of people where I thought, well, I really like that. And I really wish I could do that the same way, or know that, or be like that. But there wasn't one that would stand out where I would say, I always wanted to be like X.
Do you feel like a role model now?
To be honest, no, because I think it would be a little bit arrogant to do that. But I think one thing that happened to me years ago, which touched me very deeply, actually, and it was in a previous position, but I was at a conference, and a coral reef ecology conference in Southeast Asia somewhere, and a young lady came up to me and introduced herself, and she said, "Oh, you probably don't remember me. I was your student when you were in Indonesia, and you inspired me, and I've just finished my PhD."
Wow. Yeah.
And that was actually something where I thought, wow, that's great. I didn't realize that power effectively. And I think maybe I need to be more aware of that as well today. And maybe I need to start giving more, because I think being a role model is a big thing, but actually just being able to help people with their thinking or help people with their ideas. Because one thing that happened to me when I was very young is I met somebody on a bus, and it literally was another one of those coincidences. It was after school, I was doing my A-levels, and I met somebody on a bus who I'd been at evening school with to get my driving license. And her sister happened to work for the German Cancer Research Institute. And we were chatting, and I said, "So what are you doing now?" And she said, "Well, I'm just doing an internship with the German Cancer Research Institute." And I just thought, wow, that would be fascinating. I said, "How on earth did you manage that?" And she said, "Well, I just asked." And that little meeting on a bus has changed my entire life, because ever since then, I've simply asked. And that's made my life a lot better.
Because I have had many requests for you to be the guest of the Shipping Podcast. So I can tell you that you're a role model. Even if you don't believe it, I can tell you that. Who do you think I should interview the next time? Who would you be interested in listening to yourself?
Well, I mean, there's a number of people that I think would be very interesting to talk to. And some of them are central to the industry. I mean, the new Secretary General of IMO, Kitak Lim, he's a colleague, has been for many years. I've known him for many years, and I really highly value his thinking, because he's an accomplished diplomat, but he's also somebody who listens. And so in his position, I think he will be extremely good for our industry, because he will find that middle way between the politics and the technical requirements by listening to both sides and trying to steer us. So I think he would be great, but he's been interviewed 1 million times, so he may not be that interesting. Who I would like to hear from are people like Susan Dyer at BP. She's taken over BP shipping. She's actually a refiner. She's a chemical engineer, I think, by training. Grew up in Texas and has spent her life being posted internationally for BP, I think, always, running refineries, and she's worked all over the globe. And she took over shipping with a very open mind, but from somebody who had huge shoes. Her predecessor, John Ridgway, was very well known. He was the chairman of OCIMF, which is the Oil Companies International Marine Forum. So big shoes to fill. And she stepped into that role a year ago, and she has just made it her own. And the reports are fantastic. She's doing really well. And I think it'd be very interesting to hear how she's steering BP shipping, because, of course, they have the issues with Macondo, all of those things that they're still under a cloud effectively and suffering from, and the share prices and the oil price and everything else. But of course, she's looking at shipping specifically as a shipping arm. I think she would be very interesting.
Okay.
That might be one.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Kathi.
You're welcome.
Thank you for taking the time. And good luck with your work. I mean, you're doing so good, I think. But good luck with the next 5 years then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have had the pleasure of being present at one of the INTERTANKO board meetings when that was held at the CMA. I must say, Kathi is excellent in her role as the managing director of INTERTANKO. And she is a role model. I don't know if you know this, but I am currently participating in a masterclass for podcasting women. And as one of my tasks for last week, I was going to put together the media kit that I have needed for such a long time. So finally, you can find the media kit on the website shippingpodcast.com. And whilst doing that, I had to dive into statistics and other things that could be interesting for someone who wants to market their company in the podcast, as MF Shipping Group has done. So I dived into it, and I learned that actually there are downloads in more than 110 countries now, 6 months later. It's about 3,000 downloads every month, and it's growing, and that is so interesting. In addition to statistics, I've also read all the reviews that are on iTunes. I have found a tool to see them all, and I almost fell into tears. You are so wonderful. I really, really love the reviews, to be able to see what you think about the Shipping Podcast. My passion for Shipping Podcast might even be contagious. More people might realize that this is actually a good way of reaching an engaged audience. It's an intimate way of learning new things. I hope you give me some feedback on the interview with Kathi. I think she was wonderful. But give me a review. Let me know what you think. That will help me in the future when I think about new guests, new ways of developing the podcast. So please go into iTunes and make a review, or write it on the website shippingpodcast.com. Thank you for listening to the Shipping Podcast. Don't forget to tell everyone that you meet that there is a shipping podcast where the maritime professionals are talking about their everyday job.